So let me introduce all of you. With us today is Jade Rose. Now, Jade is a licensed financial planner who advises business owners, individuals, and families on how to manage their finances in order to achieve financial freedom, security, and fun. Jade is focused on building legacy and not just wealth, and therefore removes the worry and stress that often accompanies money management, and as a result, cultivates and enjoys long-term relationships with her clients. Mita Malik is a corporate change maker with a track record of transforming businesses. She gives innovative ideas a voice and serves customers and communities with purpose. She's currently the head of inclusion, equity, and impact at Carter, and is former head of inclusion and cross-cultural marketing at Unilever. She's had an extensive career as a marketeer in the beauty and consumer product goods space. Mita is also a LinkedIn top voice, a contributor for the publication Entrepreneur, and her writing has been published in Harvard Business Review, Fast Company, and Business Insider. And last but far from least, Nathan Coe. Nathan joined AutoTrader in 2007 to oversee the transition from a magazine business to a pure digital company. This included launching a number of new business areas, including the company's early entry and subsequent growth in mobile and online. Nathan was first appointed to the board as Chief Operating Officer in April 2017 and as Chief Financial Officer in July 2017. He was then appointed Chief Executive Officer in March last year. And prior to joining AutoTrader, Nathan was at Telstra, Australia's leading telecommunications company, where he led mergers and acquisitions and corporate development for its media and internet business. So Jade, Mita, and Nathan, welcome. Now, our focus today is on addressing how we translate current momentum into action and cultivate cultures of safe spaces to use discomfort as a catalyst for change. Now, we can all appreciate that race is a difficult but necessary subject to broach at work and at home. So let's dive into the deep end and consider the complexities and nuances. So let me begin by asking Jade, as a young woman of mixed heritage, working in a predominantly white, Western, and male-dominated culture, can you share insight on how individuals and organizations should think about professional identity through an intersectional lens?
Wow, what an opening question. Thank you, Yvonne. First and foremost, I love being invited onto panels as the voice of youth, because I'm at that awkward age where I'm definitely not young anymore, but I'm absolutely the youngest in my field. So yeah, as you said, finance is very Caucasian, very male, and the average financial advisor is 55. And what that means is it's actually going to be a mass exodus, mass retiring of financial advisors in the next 10 years. And what's interesting about that is 60% of the world's wealth will be in female hands by 2025, and there are no wealth managers to advise them what to do with that money. And so that was one of the reasons I moved into this space, because as a young mixed woman, I thought, well, there's something going on over there. There's this finance thing that I want in, but I had no clue what it was. And so, yeah, I moved over, and now part of my value proposition is giving financial advice to ethnic minorities, to women. I'm really trying to manage up as well. It's quite difficult when you are in a very white space. You don't want to rock the boat. You don't want to have the spotlight effect. You don't want to say something and think, oh, this woman's got a chip on her shoulder. Not be invited into the meeting room. So it's a challenge. I don't know if that actually answered your question. Could you repeat it again? I'll make sure I answer specifically.
Well, absolutely. I think because of your background, being young, being female, being mixed, there's a lot there to from an intersectional perspective. And obviously, you're a minority operating in a majority space, but you're not a minority from just one perspective. It's all these overlaying identities. Yeah. So it's really about how one navigates these overlaying identities. And I think we can talk a lot more about that as well. I think that the perspective that you give is a very, very insightful one. So, and I guess moving on, Nathan, let's consider more complex business environments. You have experience in mergers and acquisitions. So how do you approach navigating, newly formed organizational ecosystems where you have these complexities of intersectional identities, but also different stages of diversity and inclusion training?
Yeah, I mean, it's a good question. I think the first thing I would say is that you need to make sure that your own house is in order. And I think part of I think the good thing about where we are now is, like you said, there is a whole head of steam behind wanting to do something about this. I think the trouble is that the solutions aren't necessarily quick. They're systemic. They go right to the heart of the core and most sensitive and confidential processes within an organization: how we hire, how we develop, how we do pay, how you move people and sponsor people through the organization. And those two things are kind of at odds, because this is not something that it should be acted on quickly, but you can't expect it to necessarily be fixed quickly. So we're focused a lot on getting the systems and processes that we have in place in Auto Trader in order. And we're by no means there. Certainly if you look at the numbers in terms of composition, based on a whole different aspects, whether it's race, whether it's gender, whether it's age, social mobility, sexual orientation. So we're not there. But what we are seeing is that because we're fixing the problems at the root cause level, actually we are starting to see diversity as we bring people into Auto Trader at their early career levels, and that is starting to filter its way up. But in order to do that, it's required me to declare my support for it publicly and give the organization the permission to go and do things like form networks, come up with recommendations, start to look at pay, start to look at policies, so that you can kind of root out those systemic biases. Because we all, in the vast majority of cases, I know there's a lot to be said around unconscious biases, but it's not often malicious action that's causing these things. In some cases it will be, and we need to, that's the easy stuff to spot and actually address. It's the things that aren't the malicious actions that just kind of persist over time. Representation, role models, sponsorship, self-confidence. Some of those areas are all areas that we've had to address. So our people luckily care enormously about it. If I ask the people that join Auto Trader as employees, the number one reason they'll come back to me as to why they join isn't that we're a technology business, isn't necessarily that we're based in Manchester. It tends to be our approach to diversity and inclusion. Now, interestingly, when from an M&A perspective, you look at another company, chances are they're not as big as you. We take this stuff very seriously, so chances are they don't necessarily. And we have had a number of cases where we've looked at organisations and there is literally very little diversity, particularly at the top of the organisation. And we need to take them on the journey rather than kind of drop our stamp straight on their head, because we're a big believer actually that for the vast majority of people, this is about education and awareness and understanding the stories of other human beings and how they feel, and then starting to give them the solutions. We find if you try and just impose the solutions, you get accused of box ticking, and there's all sorts of resistance that happens, as we all know, in organizations when they haven't really been on the journey and be able to get their hearts there before their heads and the rules start to follow.
Absolutely. And you just touched there on lived experiences, something that I'm going to come back to in a second. So thank you very much for that insight. And for a minute, let's just stay with organizations, because Nathan, you've given us some great insight with regards to how organizations operate internally. From an external point of view, according to a study by Creative Investment Research in the US, companies have pledged tens of billions of dollars towards racial equity efforts. Namita, I wonder if you can share thoughts on what impact, if any, that these pledges have actually had and how organizations should be held accountable.
Thanks for having me. That's a great question. I think it's a mixed bag. I think there are some, as Nathan was saying, where there's box ticking going on, and press releases and Instagram posts. And then I think there's lots of companies who are making meaningful change. And I know progress is slow, but these things take time, unfortunately. You know, an example of a company I'm a big fan of, as you know, I'm a beauty obsessive, as you introduced me. I've sold a lot of beauty products in my career and now in fintech, but Sephora is making such great progress. I mean, they are a retailer that in 2019 was accused by customers of racist experiences and encounters. And since that time have taken on the 15% pledge, which is their pledge to put more Black and Brown owned brands on their shelves and online. They have an accelerator program where they're helping BIPOC actually from start to finish what it looks like to be in retail. And then also for the first time, they commissioned the first ever really extensive research in bias in retail and how it is that Brown and Black people in this, I've been there where I've been followed in a store because of how I look. And if I look suspicious, that people might be thinking I'm shoplifting. And so really doing research and shedding the light on how retailers can meaningfully change that. So I think that I'm a half glass full person. So I will say I'm seeing, you know, there's some good examples of companies that are holding themselves accountable.
And Mita, let's just stay with this for a second. For companies that aren't perhaps doing so well, or for companies that want to do better, what do you think that they need to do? What do you think that they need to think about? And for those that have pledged their money, what do you think are the different ways in which they could have potentially have spent that money in a more meaningful and impactful way?
I think the biggest thing is nothing for us without us. So if you want to make meaningful change and serve, let's say, the Black African-American community, how can you do that without including those voices at the table in a meaningful way? And so to be honest and say, I think just as Nathan said, many of the companies that are on this journey don't actually have the diversity representation in their workforce, right? Especially at the higher levels. So you want to authentically serve the Black community, and yet you have no Black leadership. So there's a place to start. But the second place to start is to acknowledge that and say, okay, while we're working on that, let's invite the community to help us, whether that's influencers, agencies, nonprofits, grassroots organizations. And so that's where I think a lot of missteps are made, that people just want to write a check and say, yes, this is how I'm going to show up for the community. But how are you going to show up?
And absolutely, yes.
Yes.
And that's a fantastic question. And I guess I'll bat that one back to you, Nathan, because that really is a question about internal versus external, you know, top down versus bottom up. And, you know, whilst we understand the things that are going on in your organization from an internal point of view, what value do you think does it bring to work with communities and work with the wider ecosystem in order to achieve your objectives?
Yeah, so we do a lot of it. And look, we're on a journey, so I certainly don't want to pitch ourselves as being by any means perfect at all. What I will say is we have very good intentions and we work really, really hard, which is probably a good description to my approach to my career. So we do both. I mean, what I would say from an external perspective is very often, if it is we're very, very aware of performative allyship, and I think it is something for organizations to be very, very wary of. It's very easy, and a bit to the kind of topic of this panel discussion, it's very easy to jump on these things in the heat of the moment and kind of get behind the cause. But the moment that you do that, the rest of, well, externally, they will be looking to you, and internally, probably more worryingly, they will look to you for more than just words and more than just you know, we're right behind the cause. So I do think I totally agree with Mita that it's the internal networks and the employee networks, they drive a lot of the change in Auto Trader, because you know, we don't need to seek external help on some of these things, although we do that, we do that as well. But if we want to understand what the lived experience of a Black female within Auto Trader is, we'll go and talk to them and go and ask them. And I think that's really when, I think it's the process of doing that and hearing from people that you trust and whose names that you know, and hearing experiences that you really didn't know, that actually kind of builds a lot of the momentum for change. Because, you know, in your head, you might, you know, as a white male, you might be thinking, well, I'm sure no one's ever experienced racism or prejudice at Auto Trader, and it is something that we have a zero tolerance rule about. But then you start to ask the questions, and well, actually, that does sound a bit like you have experienced prejudice, at least in your career somewhere, and if not, maybe here, and starts to open your eyes to it. On working with external organisations, I don't think you can outsource the problem, and that's not what you should be doing, I don't think, with external organisations. The way that we work with external organisations, mostly charities, is to influence, well, one angle of it is to influence the communities within which we work. So support, whether it's race, whether it's gender, trying to support those causes within, say, the Manchester area, where we have a big presence from an office perspective. So we're very localised around that because we want to be part of the community and a productive part of the community. We're also a technology company, so actually we do look to support organisations. In that case, it's actually more around gender than it is race necessarily. And then when it comes to we're also kind of at the intersection, if you like, of the automotive industry as well, which also, certainly from a leadership perspective and maybe in an overall composition perspective, has challenges from a race and gender perspective. So we support the Automotive 30% Club, which is more driven around women in leadership, but we look for those organisations that that can help us replicate or amplify what we're doing internally into other bits of the world that we influence. And it's not that we're just being focused on our own little ecosystem. It's just, you know, we're a big company in some sense. We're in the FTSE 100, but we're realistic about where we can influence. So we'd rather have more meaningful impact within a sphere that's kind of, that we have some role to play in, rather than just trying to kind of splurt out our support everywhere. So it does for us. We're very, very UK focused, and race and those issues can be very different for a global organisation rather than an organisation that's solely focused in the UK.
Absolutely. So it's more of being like locally attuned to the issues and to the problems. And you touched again there on intersectionality and lived experiences. And so I guess at this point, let's move from the organization to the individual. And I wonder, Jade, if you can perhaps share some insight on the value of moving beyond things like statistical data to actually help address inequality and injustices, and perhaps highlight reasons why understanding that lived experience of minority individuals is valuable, both for the individuals sharing their experience and for those who want to do something about it.
Yeah, great question. So I've never been a fan of race and equity data because it can be so easily skewed. A lot of the data that speaks of BIPOC people in finance, it doesn't necessarily mean front office roles, which for those who don't know, that's the client facing roles, that's the revenue generating roles. So you can easily say X% of our staff are Black or Asian. Yeah, but what roles are they in? Are they on the front lines? Are they really representing your company, and are they visible? So that's my point on data. And in terms of intersectionality, it's a healing experience to be able to speak your truth in a safe environment. And I know later we'll touch on how do we make spaces comfortable, but I don't think comfort is the aim. Safety should really be the aim, because in a comfortable space, no one really has to take responsibility. There's no accountability in a place of comfort. But if it's a safe space where I can share what it's like to be a mixed woman with a northern accent in a very southern industry, I need to know that you're hearing me, and it's not warm and fuzzy for you, because it's not warm and fuzzy for me at times being in the workspace. So yeah, that's kind of my views on the intersectionality. There was another point to your question. Sorry, Yvonne, what was that?
Well, I think firstly, I you know, thank you for that insight. I think that was really, really insightful and very helpful. And my question really was about moving away from, or rather moving beyond data, and you know, how can we really harness the value of lived experiences? You know, how can we make those voices be heard, and how can we start to think about the way in which people feel about sharing their experiences as well? Because, you know, not everyone feels that this is you know, spaces are safe spaces for them to share their experiences. Not everyone knows what the aftermath of sharing their experience might be. So what can we do to create better environments for people to be able to do that? And do we think that by creating better environments, it actually brings value?
Yeah, so I think Mita perfectly answered that earlier with people in senior management positions who are from different backgrounds, not just race, you know, able-bodied or not, or different genders. Just, I'm a big believer in if you can see it, you can be it. And the reason I moved into finance is because I saw one woman like myself, and I thought, that's it. If she can do it, so can I. And unfortunately, in finance, there's actually a higher percentage of BIPOC people in entry-level roles because there are graduation recruitment programs, but that percentage drops off as you get up the totem pole for various reasons, and perhaps Nathan may have insights on that. So for me, those safe spaces are having someone senior who can vouch for me. You know, if it all hits the fan and it doesn't become a safe space anymore, someone who can vouch for me and protect my job and say, no, I'm here, I've got you, that would make me feel the safest.
Absolutely, absolutely, and you this is a great segue. You know, now we're going into mentors and sponsors and allyship. And you know, there's research conducted by a gentleman called Thomas. He did this research in 2001, whereby he argued that while there are many relationships required to advance in the corporate world, for Black professionals, sponsorship is critical. He also notes that while promising white professionals could fast track their careers at an earlier stage, the critical stage for minorities to prove themselves was middle management, which he describes as the catching up and breaking out period. So Nathan, as we address the barriers to success for Black professionals, how can we do this without creating an environment that breeds contention amongst white peers and counterparts who may not necessarily understand or experience these barriers and therefore might question the need for things like accelerator programs?
I think that is a brilliant question, and we've learned a bit about this on our journey. I'll perhaps give you the answer, what I believe the answer to be to your question first, and then unpack it a little bit. Where we have ended up is that at the end of the day, what we're really looking to achieve is for everyone to feel included. And there are some people that, some groups at the moment that are definitely not, that don't necessarily feel included, or feel as though they're the only person in the room, and that can impact their likelihood to contribute, and they get spotted and be picked as talent and developed, and so on. So what we've, so that's where we've got to. So all of everything that we do on race, we do on sexual orientation, disability, neurodiversity, age. We're kind of spending a bit more time understanding social mobility, so that we get to a place where actually the world, our organization, can genuinely be a meritocracy where, you know, the best people for the job are able to do that job within auto trade. And we believe strongly that if we do that well, you will have representative, you know, at every layer of the organization, you will have good representation, because we know that talent isn't biased to what kind of one group of people over another group of people. The way that we've handled the very specific point that you've made, which I haven't heard of the research, but it does make it sound like we've been very scientific in our approach to this. We got to a very simple problem. We got really good at early careers and bringing in you know, diverse groups of people into our organization. What we're trying to do, though, is kind of get that to filter the whole way through. And what we found is that when most leadership development programs focus on maybe my team and one or two layers below that. But if you do that, you don't necessarily have those kind of diverse groups of people yet within the organization. So where we ended up was, we have to go further down into mid-career, exactly as Thomas has suggested. So we are empirical evidence for the paper that he wrote 18 years ago. And we've put in place what we call the Diverse Talent Accelerator program, where anyone, going back to the everyone being included, anyone can apply to that program. It is for, it's specifically around people finding their voice, finding their own style of leadership, thinking about what's the best way to navigate my career, because, you know, particularly from a social mobility perspective, well, I mean, as you've said a few times, there are so many intersections here, that it might mean that they've never had that career advice, or they've never had people that have done that before in their family and networks. So we focus on some of those very pragmatic levels and look to kind of, and those people are selected based on their talent. We kind of look to, from a positive action perspective, we actively go out and encourage certain individuals. We really think you should apply for this. We think it would be a great program for you. But then we pick purely based on talent and potential. Now, as it turns out, surprise, surprise, you end up with quite a diverse group of people. We take them through the program. And the idea is that through that, we'll then move into the formal sponsorship, and those sponsors' job is to kind of clear the way for those people as you go through the organization. Because I think very often the reason why the majority can continue to be the majority is because they're the natural, there is sponsorship going on there. It just doesn't look like it's not formally called it, but that's kind of what's going on. And you do need to kind of step in and say, actually, well, let's do that thing, but in a slightly different way.
Absolutely. And I think in stepping in and doing that in a slightly different way, you know, there's this question around how do you bring people on the journey? How do you have those conversations? How do you open those conversations, especially with perhaps white people? And how do we best go about opening conversations with white people on Black lived experiences and the barriers that they might actually face? And I wonder whether, Mita, you might be able to speak to this.
That's a great question and a difficult question. I think even when you ask that question, some of us become uncomfortable that you just asked that question. And I've had
I stumbled asking the question.
It's because it's the nature of, we just don't talk about race enough. It's just the elephant in the room. It's uncomfortable. You don't see color. That doesn't matter. You imagined it, right? All of those things that I think many people of color face in their organizations. But when I have white leaders who come to me and say, Black Lives Matter, I really care about this, and I want to show up for the Black community, and they're doing all the right things with pledges and statements and the money and everything we talked about. And the uncomfortable question I have to ask is, okay, so do you have any meaningful relationships with Black individuals? Because that is where we start to self-segregate, right? And so I will ask leaders, you know, how are you spending your time on the weekends? Where do you go out to eat? Where do you do your groceries? Who cuts your hair? And when you have a big life moment, who are the 5 people you would call in your life outside of your family? And if they all look like you and act like you and think like you, then we're self-segregating. And so, as all of us know, billions of dollars have been spent in organizations in the diversity, equity, and inclusion space. And this work starts at home. It starts in our communities. I can't put you through a few hours of training and check the box, we're done. The journey to be a more inclusive leader, to be a kinder human being, it starts at our kitchen tables. And so thinking about how you can be building meaningful relationships with individuals without it coming off as tokenistic, right? So as Nathan said, if you want to understand the experience of a Black woman and work with her, get to know her as a person. And as Jade had mentioned, then the safety will come, right? Because if we get to know each other as people, then this individual will feel comfortable sharing what they're going through. And so that's what I think is really missing in all of this, is like, it really comes down to the individual. And
absolutely, yes.
And it starts at home. We can't undo all of the things we've learned over years. Like, we have to undo it. A training is not going to undo that for you.
And I think Nathan touched on earlier as well, it's really about getting to that root cause. It's really important that we start from the right place. And just with regards to staying with that, you know, staying with what you talked about investments, I've got a question here from Nina to Mita. Do Black entrepreneurs with Black products have the power to be represented in Sephora? Or, you know, I know that you may not specifically want to speak to Sephora, but just in general. Or does Sephora have non-Black businesses selling so-called Black products?
That's a good question, right? That's diversity washing, right? So if I'm coming up with, and I'm not talking about Sephora specifically, right? I'm talking about in general, right? So it's, again, nothing for us without us. We certainly, to Nathan's point, don't want to be outsourcing any of these efforts, but you have to be really careful. If you want to be creating products, brands, and services for a community, and you don't have anyone who authentically knows that community, right? So as a marketer, one of the biggest things a marketer can do, Yvonne, is like surprise and delight you with something you never expected, right? That's the job of a marketer. But do I know your community and the history of your community? And likely I don't, right? In many cases I don't. And so I have to take a step back and see who's sitting around the table and are those voices represented? And so, yes, I think that's a great question. And I do think in Sephora's case, when you go and please look up their accelerator program. I don't work for Sephora. I just spend too much money there. But they have a BIPOC program for founders, and they are helping founders every year go through sort of the process to get retail ready and then putting them on shelf. And so and Target has a program. So many retailers now you're seeing doing this where they're saying, hey, we want these brands, Black and brown owned businesses on their shelves in store, and we'll help you do it.
Interesting. Well, I hope that answers your question, Nina. I have another question / comment from Shelley. Shelley says, I think data has its place, but to your point, Jade, it's what we do with it. How will it be used to make sure we feel seen and heard as employees and not become a tick box recruitment driven issue? And, Jade, I guess it would be great to hear from your perspective, especially in the FS space where, data is king. And, there are all these conversations taking place over the use of our data. How can we make sure that data actually becomes impactful and meaningful and helps people get seen and heard?
Yeah, so this is more to do with women in finance than race, but we partner with an amazing initiative called Wealthy Hair, which looks at the psychology of female investing, the disparities between men and women, what the motivations are. And what we found is, well, actually, to Mita's point, these things really start at the home. And one of the findings was, we teach our boys to be brave, but we teach our girls to be careful. Now that manifests in men investing and women saving, and as a result, women retire with a pension worth just 1/5 of the male counterpart. I think, but in terms of the data, that's a tricky one. I'm not a stats person beyond my markets. How do we use them to our advantage? I don't have an answer on that one, I'm afraid. Maybe perhaps Nathan has something he could share.
I think it's a very good question. And there is not just because of the data. I mean, as a public company, we report gender pay gap. We voluntarily report ethnicity pay gap as well. And you're definitely putting yourself, you're putting a lot of transparency out there and a lot of onus on yourself to, at the very least, explain why the results aren't where they want you to be, and hopefully tell the story about what you're doing to make them better. I think it's really difficult because where I've got to, I totally agree with the question. There is a risk that when you use data, actually, it's not so much data, and I think the question might have said this, it's how you use it. And I think where it becomes more interesting is targets. So I'll give you a very practical example. This relates to gender, not race, but the same would necessarily be true. So we thought, well, we want to get our organization diverse. So the right way to do that is to, we can't just necessarily go and hire these people, because we would have already done that. We would have already done that if we could do that. So we thought, well, we need to bring people into technology, into Auto Trader, and move them up through the ranks. Now, if you bring a whole bunch of, in this case, let's say women, but the same would be true of people of BIPOC, if you bring them into the lower level of the organization, you're doing the right thing because your intent is to move them through the organization, but you're lowering the mean average salary of a BIPOC person at Auto Trader because you're bringing more in the bottom. So actually, the very action you should take will damage the target or the number that everyone's paying a lot of attention to. So like Jade, I don't know what the answer is. The answer we get to is we're going to do the right thing. We'll tell our stories, and the numbers will be what the numbers will be. But over the longer period of time, what I've found with this whole issue is if you don't look at the numbers and say, well, why have we not got 15% of hires over £40,000? Why is that not from the BAME community, whereas actually it's 20% when we look at the other bands? So I think the data is really helpful for diagnosis and accountability. With targets, you know, I have a general view that targets can do all sorts of strange things to human behavior, and that's just as true when it comes to race and diversity as it is, you know, financial targets and the sorts of things that have cropped up in the past few years as it relates to commissions and the like.
Absolutely.
So not really an answer, but maybe sympathy with the question.
I mean, I think, yeah, I think, you know, it's a very big question, and one that a lot of corporations and organizations are finding challenging at the moment as they're being held to account to use data for good. And, you know, time will tell how people interpret that and how people respond to that. So thank you very much for that insight. One other thing I wanted to touch on, and it's something that was brought up earlier with regards to this internal, external. It was about organizations working with external bodies. And I wonder, how could organizations bring in external, for example, not-for-profit partners to make change, and also, you know, grassroots organizations, etc. And I wondered, Mita, whether you might have any insight on this.
I think in particular, if you're looking at changing public policy or helping to think about how you meaningfully want to serve a community, you should be working with that community. It's sort of full stop. I mean, nothing for us without us. From a US perspective, Dove, which is a large brand from Unilever, has the Crown Coalition Act. And that is legislation they're passing in the US state by state to make it illegal to discriminate on the basis of hair, particularly for Black individuals where they are discriminated on the basis of hair. And so that's pretty amazing that that brand over the last 2 years has taken up that cause and is working with the NAACP. So for like a cause like that, you cannot, it is a coalition that brand is helping to form. It is not just the brand that can do that. It is nonprofit, public policy makers. And so that's a really one great example of when a brand says, and as Nathan said, not for the faint-hearted, if you're going to stand for a cause, you have to go all the way. And Dove certainly has gone all the way in that and brought the right partners at the table. So Dove knows what their expertise is. They know how much they care about this for not only the brand, but for the community and their consumer base. And they also know what they don't know. So they're finding the partners and gathering them around the table.
Right, absolutely. And I think when it comes to also, you know, driving change, we're seeing that a lot of, especially young people, are holding these organizations to account. You know, and I wonder, Jade, you'd be the perfect person to shed some light on, you know, how young people are really becoming the source of change.
Yeah, so a big portion of the people I work with are Gen Z. I'm so energized and inspired by them. And if anyone's going to change the world, it's them. I have a love-hate relationship with social media. I think the positive side of things is, for example, Marcus Rashford, for those who don't know, is a UK footballer. He campaigned to feed underprivileged children over COVID. And he said, I'm not a campaigner, I'm just the bridge. And I thought, well, wouldn't it be wonderful if we used companies as a bridge? There are people out there like Marcus Rashford, like grassroots organizations who can partner with organizations and really use social media in a positive way. But on the flip side, and going back to my earlier points of comfort and safety, we live in this era of cancel culture. And people are just so frightened to say the wrong thing. And it's something I actually wanted to ask Nathan how he felt, you know, running a listed company. Is there that fear of getting it wrong? And do you think that stops other people from putting action into place?
Yeah, I mean, I probably suffer from lots of people in my position, a general fear of getting things wrong. Unfortunately, that fear is partly driven by a reasonably high level of confidence that from time to time I will get things wrong. I think as it relates to some of these topics, yeah, the way I've compensated for it, if you like, is by putting in the effort to really understand. Actually, I mean, Yvonne, you've mentioned it quite a few times, the real lived experiences of different groups of people in their words, from their perspective, not necessarily from, sometimes, although not always, trying to get it from, you know, the mouths of people directly impacted by these things, rather than the people that are very often speaking on their on their behalf. So yeah, I think that because actually we and I am genuinely doing this for the right reasons. I do believe it has business benefits, but I just think it's the right thing to do. But in this space, and I think I often say this internally, that saying that, you know, sticks and stones may break my bones, but words will never hurt me. Well, I think what we've learned is that is just a load of rubbish, and words can really, really hurt people. Maybe if you're in the majority, it's all right. If you're kind of, you know, small microaggressions here, mispronouncing names there, words really, really matter. And I think because the words really, really matter, actually, and you want to be really respectful to people, you do need to take quite a bit of time to ensure that you understand not just the underlying issues, but even, you know, the current state of the conversations, to ensure that you aren't letting your words get in the way of your support and real intent for the message. I mean, you know, the acronyms around race, I think we spoke about it earlier, a perfect example. You know, is BAME a good thing or a bad thing? Well, it lumps a whole different group of people together. They're experiencing all sorts of different things, but maybe there's something we can get collectively. And then you have BIPOC. I think it is an area where, yeah, I'm quite aware, because I only want to be trying to do the right thing, and I'm acutely aware that I am from the majority. I guess I'm Australian, so I can, you know, we're all an intersection of a whole bunch of things. But you know, the fact is, I'm coming from, you know, that place of privilege relative to a lot of other people. But
Understood.
I feel like I'd sooner make a mistake with a good heart and well intentions and be part of affecting change. Because, you know, if you look at the people in power, if you look at the top of organizations, a lot of them do. We know the percentages, a lot of the people do look like me. So actually having voices like that, I think it's a worthwhile cause. And sometimes you just got to be willing to make a mistake in order to make something good happen.
Absolutely, absolutely. And I think talking about voices, you know, and talking about, you know, conversations, we've just got a question here from Dylan, actually, that wonders, how do organizations ensure that their actions speak to the values that they shout about, especially when it comes to the fact that millennials and Gen Z are demanding this? And I think if Jade, if you'd like to speak to that, and perhaps Mita, if you'd like to pitch in on that one as well, that would be great.
Yeah, Mita, why don't you go ahead with your thoughts first?
Yeah, I mean, I would just add, there's some great research from Edelman, which is a large independent communications firm, that talks about the rise in belief-driven buying is here to stay. So back to cancel culture, back to brands whose values Gen Z and millennials don't feel like will match, they'll stop buying and they'll boycott. And so I think there is real marketplace implications for the first time as the demographics globally are changing, that it's no longer a nice to have, it's a must have. And the consumer is voting with their wallet. I will just add, going back to something Nathan said, which I think is really important, and Jade's question about cancel culture, it is about intent versus impact. I think about our relationships with companies, our relationships with people. Most people are forgiving if you know your intentions were good, but the impact landed the wrong way. I mean, we have from the Me Too movement, many individuals who I believe deserve to be canceled, and they're on the path to redemption. And then there are some people who just were learning. I get it wrong. And if I can just say, Jade, I got it wrong, I'm sorry. And then what matters most is not the apology. It's like, how do I show up for you afterwards? And how do I consistently show up for you? And I think that's not only just for leaders, it's for companies as well.
Yeah, and I'll just add to that. I too am a consumer of all of the millennial beauty brands, the Glossier, the Sephora is a highlight of my trip to Paris, because sadly we don't have one in London. And again, back to social media, what I've noticed is we have almost like vigilante groups now, kind of calling out companies. There's really nowhere to hide anymore. Diet Prada, if anyone is familiar with them, is one of my favorites. What they do is they call out companies who are ripping off designs from younger Black designers, Asian designers, and they're putting them out there and saying, look, side by side, this isn't okay. So I think, to Mita's point, yes, it's not a nice to have anymore. It's a non-negotiable. And from my perspective, I've turned down offers from companies where I've seen for myself, or I've heard, you know, they say one thing, but they're doing something else inside. I think one of the positives for me personally off the back of COVID is I feel like the employee has a lot more leverage in what they can demand from their employer. And for a lot of millennials and Gen Z, it is DE&I. So I'm although the surge in kind of the collective conscience over the past 2 years, I'm sure I speak for many when I say it's a lot. It's a lot to take on. It's heavy, and it's not something we can sustain at 100%. But it does make me feel hopeful for the first time in a long time. I have colleagues around me who, for the first time, are saying, "Oh, I didn't think of this. What are your thoughts?" Or "I've been reading this book." So yeah, I think we're moving in the right direction.
I mean, I think that's very good to know, and an optimistic view for the generation that is coming behind. Because I guess one of the things that we should highlight is the fact that, you know, for many generations beforehand, although the word was coined in, I think, 1967 by Stokely, this notion of institutional racism really only started, you know, moving from being a concept or a notion to something that we understand is real in more recent times. So one has to wonder what this might mean for the younger generation now, who can no longer hide behind naivety and just, you know, jump in and navigate it as they see it or as they unfold. This is now a real thing that they now know that will be presented before them. And so I guess the question would be, in a bid to create spaces and opportunities and change, what would be the key thing that we need organizations to think about and that we need individuals to consider? And I guess, Nathan, if you could kick us off with that, that would be fantastic.
Yeah, I mean, I don't think there are any silver bullets. I think it does require, you know, these are complex issues and they need to be undone in reasonably complex ways. But I think one, certainly something that's proved to be powerful for us, really powerful, inspirational. It's helped the organization learn. It's given people voice. It's given people a sense of belonging. Is employee networks or guilds or whatever you want to call them, around all different aspects of diversity. Race and ethnicity is one, sexual orientation another, age, as I said, I've mentioned quite a few of those, disability, neurodiversity. We've found that those networks getting together, certainly during COVID, provided one another with a lot of support. You know, no two human beings are the same. At the end of the day, we're all individuals, but there is common experiences and therefore benefit from common support whilst we were going through, you know, the trauma, I guess, of the last 18 months. But interestingly, as we've emerged from the other side of it, it is a big part of our organizational conversation and a big part of understanding one another's lived experiences. The guilds are putting on events, the networks, sorry, are putting on events. They're doing talks to the whole company. They're choosing they're choosing which external organizations they want to work with. I get no say in it. I've never actually been asked my own opinion on it, but there is a fund that we have, and each of the networks can choose which organizations fit best with what they're trying to achieve, both inside Auto Trader and outside Auto Trader. So, I mean, I have to say, to the extent that we've done good, which I think we have done a lot of good, no small amount of that credit, indeed a lot of the credit, goes down to networks, which actually the formation of those networks was as much around creating a safe space and sense of belonging as it was about affecting change. Now, I'd like to think they've become about helping the rest of the organization understanding the world from their perspective.
Absolutely, yeah.
You know, and they've almost become a proactive part of the change without it, you know, and it's all happened very organically and without anyone necessarily asking them to do so. And that's included reverse mentoring. You know, our BAME Guild, which they'll point out, is building a multicultural environment as opposed to the way the acronyms are normally used, carrying out reverse mentoring both with the leadership team and our PLC board, which off their own bat, but with obviously the permission of the people, which it's been one of the most powerful experiences on my journey in understanding some of these issues better.
Amazing and amazing. And Mita, I wonder if you can add anything to that. Space is opportunity to change.
I would just remind people that individuals and organizations are not separate. Individuals make up the organization. So to anyone listening, think about the tipping point. If each of us thought about how we're going to show up in the impact, you're hiring for a role. Ask your recruiter why there's on a diverse slate. Going back to the second point of Nathan and sponsorship, like whose career are you fighting for other than your own? Whose career are you fighting for and advancing, and why? And then the final piece is, I don't care if you have $5,000 or $50,000 and you're making a video, think about who you're giving that check to and that opportunity to come into your ecosystem and work. So I would ask each of us to think about how we can show up differently in our organization.
Absolutely. Jade, closing words?
Yeah, I just wanted to add quickly to that companies have no choice but to get this right, because if they don't, Gen Z are making money on their own. And that's why I said at the start of this, I love when I'm called young, because when I look at the 18, 19-year-olds that I work with who are making money in ways that boggle the city, they're like, this guy's making $5,000 a video by cutting open slime. It's just a whole new space. So what we're seeing is 21, 22-year-olds starting their own company. Stephen Bartlett of Social Chain, I think he's 27 now. He's now the newest dragon on Dragon's Den. You know, if companies don't get this right, Gen Z have the means, the skill set, and the drive to build their own.
Absolutely. And on those words, this brings the session to a close. I'd like to thank our panelists, Jade Rose, Mita Malik, and Nathan Coe, and we hope that you all enjoy the rest of the summit. So thank you.
Thanks, Yvonne.
Thank you.